So today we're going to look at the social changes that result from new cities, both at the cities themselves and then within different social classes throughout the 19th century. So starting in the early 1800s, running through the late 1800s, and seeing kind of the massive social changes and upheaval. So we'll start with these new cities. So the late 19th century, that is the late 1800s, we have massive boom in cities. They start springing up everywhere. And that's for a number of different reasons, but mostly because that's where there's jobs, that's where people can go for work, and people are having more children. They need places to go. So that's where factories are. That's where people are going. And these cities are good, but they also have some drawbacks. And one of the things is that they put a lot of pressure on the traditional lifestyle. You got to remember, for hundreds, if not thousands of years, people had lived in rural Europe in family units and in small villages. And now everyone's moving to these large cities, and that really transforms the way people look at themselves and their lifestyles and their cultures. And so we'll see later on how this affects the way people view themselves and institutions such as marriage and family and these sorts of things. And although there are economic opportunities in these cities, people don't have to rely on the land. They can be the fifth son and not worry about no inheritance, but go off and make a living working in factories or other odd jobs. There are some negatives to the cities. They're dirty, they're poorly housed, there's no sanitation, and there's this kind of pervasive sense of hopelessness and despair that hangs over these cities, in part because of this poor housing, the no sanitation, and the dirtiness. Like, these places were just miserable. They weren't fun to live in. And although there may have been opportunities, it would really beat down people, especially those who were used to the countryside lifestyle. So those are kind of the new cities, and they really take off in the 19th century. And these three numbers right here really show how crazy this growth is. So in 1801, 17% of the overall population of Great Britain lives in cities. It's a small number, and that's like a case study, but that can be applied throughout Europe. Very few people are living in cities. Most of them are living in rural areas. And you see that 90 years later, by 1891, fully 54% of the overall population of Great Britain lives in a city. That's a drastic change. That's a tripling in the number of people in a cities. And so these populations are growing right alongside factories and other sorts of employment opportunities, but they're growing much too rapidly for people to handle. City populations could grow from 40 to 70% in a single decade, and quite frankly, it would overwhelm the cities and their available resources in order to make things good. And that's part of why we have such awful conditions in the cities, is there's simply too many people coming in for the infrastructure to support them. Within cities, initially in the early 1800s, quality of life, and really through most of the 1800s, quality of life is very poor. There's little to no public land or parks available in these cities. Every square inch is taken up by housing or factories, and they have to be super close to each other because people would walk to work. So in order to get to work, they would need to be close by. They couldn't have these cities spread out. So you start to see these shanties thrown up to keep everything close. So these houses are side by side in rows, and that's where they get the nickname row houses, because they look just like they're lined up, ducks on a pond, straight in a row. And these are not nice houses. There's no yards. People are crammed into these. They would take what should have been a one-family house, and they'd jam in a bunch of different families in there just to make it work. Along the streets, you have open sewage. You have, I'm not even going to call it drains, but just sewage trenches that would just run down the middle of these streets as a way for people to get rid of their refuse, but it wouldn't really go anywhere. Occasionally, in theory, this would run off into the river, into the ocean, but it's not exactly the most practical system for doing that. And if you were lucky enough, you had an outhouse that you got to share with multiple other families. And so, I mean, you just got to imagine the squalor that they're living in. That this is just really a time of awfulness where it's just not a good place to be. It's not a city as we would view it now, but really the slums as we would perceive it. And the reason why these cities initially fail is because simply, first off, they're overwhelmed. More and more people are moving to the cities. They cannot cope with this number of people in such a rapid pace. Going hand in hand with that is there's a lack of public transportation. So everyone has to live within walking distance, reasonable walking distance of what they need. And so cities can't grow out, so they try and grow up, but the technology isn't quite there to grow up, so they just cram people together. The government is slow to create laws that will solve this because the government doesn't know how to handle anything like this. Never before had such a crush of humanity been in one spot. This is a new problem, and the government doesn't know how to solve it, so it takes them a long time to try to solve it. It's the same thing we see throughout history. Anytime the government is confronted with something new they don't know how to deal with, what we saw with industrialization and labor laws. It took years, decades for child labor laws to get into place. The same thing with this and city codes that would make houses safe. The government simply doesn't know how to respond. They don't know what the answer is, so it takes a long time. And there's this long-standing tradition of poor housing. You've got to remember that people came from the countryside where they lived in huts with no floor besides the dirt underneath them. Everyone crammed into one room and living with the animals. So although we are repulsed by the images of these industrialized cities, this kind of dirtiness and kind of unfathomable cramped lifestyle was acceptable back then. That's what they were used to. And they probably didn't like it, but they tolerated it because that was all they knew. And so this kind of leads to this growing complacency, like, well, I guess that's just the way it is. And so all of these factors combine to create these failures in these cities initially. And it is only later in the 1800s, with some advances in sanitation, that things start to get better. And the three important people that you should know are Edwin Chadwick, who growing out of the Enlightenment, tries to use reasoning, then uses the scientific revolution, and uses rational reasoning from that to try to solve social problems. How can we solve these social problems using these scientific methods? So on and so forth. He argues that disease and death are causes of this poverty, and that if we could eliminate those diseases and the death, we could help to eliminate poverty. And he thought that we could eliminate diseases by cleaning up cities. Shocking. If we remove human excrement by using underground sewers that were now affordable thanks to massive industrialized facilities that would build iron pipes, then we would have kind of healthier, cleaner cities. Okay, this flew in the face of the popular view of miasmatic theory, which people thought they got sick by breathing in bad odors, not coming into contact with the actual bacteria themselves. And this doesn't really change until Louis Pasteur comes along with germ theory, where he kind of identifies these microbial organisms that are causing these diseases. And so he calls these germs, and then he realizes that if you heat them up, you can kill them. So he's identified now the cause of these diseases and a way to kill them. And so he uses this pasteurization process on many different liquids in order to kill any bacteria living in them. At the same time, you have a guy by the name of Joseph Lister who argues for this use of chemical disinfectant to destroy other bacteria, specifically on surgical instruments, making things cleaner. So people are realizing we cannot live in this filth. Things have to get better. And those three guys, Chadwick, Pasteur, and Lister, really helped to push that forward. Along with that, you have governments begin to use urban planning, and this will alleviate some of the congestion, some of the chaos. And they model themselves after the first urban planned city of Paris. And Paris becomes a model for a number of reasons. First is they take these old buildings that they have, these cramped buildings that are getting in the way and falling down, and they bulldoze them. And they replace them with these nice, broad, wide open boulevards running through the streets, and these would be tree-lined and beautiful. This would also increase traffic flow. It'd be easier to move around the city. They demolished the old slums with the idea that they could come back and build new buildings there. And this kind of improvement in in streets and in infrastructure kind of stimulates the economy. It's adding more money in. As there's nicer streets, people are wanting to build nicer houses, people are wanting to move these neighborhoods. So you kind of have all of these effects happening at once. Now, the reason why they're demolishing these slums and building these old buildings is in part to improve the city, but it's also in part to stop any potential future revolutions and uprisings in Paris. The French had that bad experience in 1848, where people would crowd into these small alleys, block themselves off from the government troops, and be really difficult to dislodge. And so the Parisians realized, if we make these broad boulevards, that's much harder to blockade themselves in. It's much easier to control our crowds. So there's kind of an underlying reason why the government's doing this. Paris also has a lot of planned parks and public spaces, sewers and aqueducts that bring in fresh water and take out the filth. And so by setting this up, they've created the beginnings of a modern city that allows people to actually enjoy living in the city. Now, who enjoys that is kind of a different story. It's not for everyone, that's for sure. And then one of the biggest, most impactful inventions of this time was the electric streetcar, which was introduced from the United States. This allows the city to be more spread out. People no longer have to walk the entire place, the entire distance to where they're going. They can hop on one of these electric cars, which will get them there quicker and cheaper than the horse that they replace. The horses were also significantly more messy than these electric streetcars. This allows the cities to spread out. People could live no longer in walking distance from work, but in trolley distance. And then people can move about the city at a reasonable pace, so they have leisurely outings on the weekend. So it really just redefines the city, and these remnants are still in some places. San Francisco still runs their cable cars. That is essentially the electric streetcar. So these cities would have had the same type of system running around at this time. Now, one of the results of this radical changes in cities is a new social hierarchy. And this is partly because of the city, partly because of the economy. So what we have is the wages of British workers are doubling over the late 1800s. And this seems like a good thing, right? Everyone's getting more money. That's great. That's in part due to a growing economy, in part due to inflation, but it is a good thing, that's for sure. Despite this, poverty still exists. So everyone's wages double, but your poverty wages doubled from like really bad poverty to bad poverty. And so this creates problems, and this leads to vast economic inequality, where 5% of all households control 33% of the wealth, right? And when you extrapolate that number to the top 20% of the household, they have 50 to 60% of all national income. And then at the bottom, that's the haves, really. And then at the bottom, you have 30% of households receiving less than 10% of all total incomes. The have-nots. So it's really a sharp divide, which is problematic. And this is partly where Marx gets his arguments against the classes and pushes for this class struggle. But this urban society really continues to propagate this divide by splitting people in where they're living, by showcasing the poorness, and by condemning workers to a life of repetitive factory work with no real hope of moving up. And so we'll look a little bit more closely at the middle class and the working class, because things really change for them. The middle class is kind of consists of three major groups that could be subdivided if you wanted to. First, there's the upper middle class, right? And this is business families from banking, industry, commerce, like real well-established, strong, economically and socially business family. And what they tried to do is they tried to emulate the aristocratic lifestyle that they saw in the nobility and the upper class. So they had these giant houses and these lavish parties. And one of the big things to keep in mind is class isn't always about money. It's about the way you carry yourself. It's about your social standing. It's about your social morals and who you're fitting in with. And so they really tried to emulate those above them to try to move into that group. The middle class is the industrialists, the merchants, the lawyers, the doctors, etc. And then the lower middle class, all within the middle class, of course, is shopkeepers, small traders, local business owners, those sorts of people who still make a decent living, but not anything great. And so in this time period, we're seeing new additions to the middle class because with cities come demands for new professions. Some of those are engineers and architects. You have advances in science where you have chemists. You have public officials who need to run these cities, nurses, teachers, etc. Suddenly you have the infrastructure that calls for all these doctors and lawyers. Where before you have, villages of 200 to 400 people, you don't need doctors and lawyers there. You have one for the region. In a city of hundreds of thousands, you need lots of doctors and lots of lawyers. So what we see is this rise of cities allows the middle class to expand and diversify and to grow and in power, both economically and politically. In the middle class culture, there are certain behavioral expectations that go along with this. They expected people to be very prim and very proper. They expected kind of this Victorian style where everyone would be, straight-faced, very put together. There's also an expectation that families would host social events and would display their wealth. So families would have weekly dinner parties, and this would cost them 25% of their income would go to food and drink and entertaining in this sort of thing. And this is just outrageous for us to think about, but it was their way of trying to fit in and feel a sense of belonging in this new defined middle class. They would also have expectations to have servants living with them, so we have servants' quarters, and those would be drawn from the poor and working classes. They would live in nice houses in the good parts of the city, along these nice boulevards, or if those boulevards didn't exist, in nice houses away from the slums. We see also a fashion consciousness that begins to spread across the middle class, so people are aware of what they're wearing and they're kind of trying to fit in. And again, you have this strict code of morality. They look down on drunkenness, on kind of promiscuity or sexual deviance. So that kind of unites them in their middle class more than their income, because there is such disparity in income. But it is this strict morality and the fact that they have money and servants that unites them as a middle class. The working class also kind of falls into this three different categories, and the working class is huge. It's approximately 80% of the entire population. But this working class has three groups. First is what they call the labor aristocracy, and that's the highly skilled workers. And these would be people who worked in factories as kind of foremen and had really useful skills and made a good wage, but certainly not enough to be able to afford a servant living in or anything like that. And these people were always under the threat of being replaced by new technology. So their lives, their existence were very tenuous. And they, trying to emulate the middle class that they were trying to reach into, also had a moral value system to define themselves. And they held themselves to very high morality and really looked down on the remainder of the lower classes. They tried to distance themselves. And so the other two groups would have been skilled and semi-skilled and unskilled urban workers, such as factory workers, and then unskilled and day laborers. And those included longshoremen, those would be people who work the docks, wagon drivers, servants, and kind of the rest, right? Everybody else falls into that category. So that's the working class and the way they're divided. And their culture changes drastically as well. You'll have three main activities. They're leisure activities. They finally begin to have leisure time. And that's really one day off a week if they're lucky. But they fill that time with drinking. And that will lead to later serious, significant social problems that have to be addressed. With sports, but they're replacing now the blood sports of bull baiting and cockfighting with team and spectator sports, soccer, horse racing, polo, these sorts of activities that they can kind of enjoy. And then music halls. Music is huge at this time, and so these poor are able to afford music halls in these new cities, which is all entirely new experience for them. And then we get to this weird dichotomy within the working class of religion, where religion is still an overriding, but I'll call it a conflicting factor. People in the lower class and this working class tend to be anti-established religion, in part because they feel like that's one of the organizations that's keeping them oppressed, but also because they don't go to church regularly, and that's simply, it could be a number of things. One, anti-establishment feeling. Two, no church within walking distance. Or three, kind of this disconnect from the church and that idea. But they're still really religious. And so there's this weird kind of dichotomy of this decline in church attendance, but at the same time, a religious revival takes hold. And so the lower class and the middle class, for that matter, are trying to find themselves and figure out exactly where it is they belong within this new urban society that's kind of rising up as a result of the Industrial Revolution.